So, welcome to this webinar on better understanding exercise and pain. Thank you to everyone who has chosen to spend a little bit of time with me on this Tuesday night in September. Hopefully, we can learn together and we can understand a little bit better the problem of pain and of exercise for pain as well, which is pretty interesting stuff. So we can nerd out together, and we can have a look at kind of some of the things that we know. Thank you to everyone who has let us know where they are from. Thank you very much, all over the world. So I am going to share my screen. Zoom has um, changed its layout all around, and I'm a little bit discombobulated. So this is our opening slide: exercise and pain. How does it work? And I think that's a really important question. And so, of course, I can't let the exact how does it work for everybody. But the point of this lecture is to think about some of the potential things and ways that it could help people, whether that's kind of a causal variable such as a mediator, whether it's a less causal variable such as a moderator, or perhaps it's some kind of mechanism that we can potentially think about and discuss a little bit more. So let's get into it. So look, I wonder if you can do me a small favor. If you can take a moment, if you see an interesting slide or something that interests you just generally within this lecture, please feel free, and I'd be really grateful if you took a little picture of the slide, tagged me in, put it in your Instagram story or wherever else, just to support me and help me to continue to provide a little bit of free education for you. So that would be a little job that you can do to make me happy and also eternally grateful as well. And one day, potentially, I can return the favor for you. All right. So, big question. And I think, some people might ask, Ben, who cares? Who gives a shit? And that would be an absolutely, totally fair question to ask. Now, for some people, it doesn't matter whether, it doesn't matter why something may work. It just matters if it works. So we could say, does exercise work for pain? Brilliant. That's fine. And we may need to not want or need to go any deeper or any further. Unfortunately, that's not my type of character. I love to delve deeply into these things because I'd like to improve what I do. At the moment, we know that things that we do aren't actually that fantastic for our patients. Sometimes they can have fantastic effects. Other times they have very little effect. And in fact, sometimes even treatments make people worse. And that happens a lot more often than we probably like to admit. But who cares why it works? Well, I believe the more that we know why, the more plausible we become, the better we are able to explain things to people. And then also, if we know how these things work, are we therefore better at adapting, adjusting, and making them work better? And I think that's really the key. If we understand a little bit more about, is this related to descending inhibition? Is it related more to the immune system? Is it related more to psychology? Is it biomechanics? Is it physiological? That we therefore understand what makes it work, and hopefully we can make it work better. And I know everyone that's on this call today, this webinar today, cares deeply about helping people, and therefore probably also wants to make these things work a little better. So we can work a little better by understanding a little better. So who cares? I care. All right. There are probably a whole bunch of people that don't care and just think, Ben, shut up. Don't worry. Get on with your job. But I think if we can improve what we do, improve how we do it, we can do a better job. And if I can be part of that, then I'm going to be really happy. So who cares? Ben cares. All right. Something that I often say, and some people get their panties in a wad over this, is that exercise for fitness is not the same as exercise for pain. All right. So, what I mean by that is that if we think we're going to go to the gym, get big and get strong and get muscles and get fit, and the fitter we get and the stronger we get and the bigger we get, that's going to have more of an effect on people's painful problems. As someone who is evidence based, I don't think that we have the evidence to say that. Now, does that mean evidence for fitness is useful for pain? Absolutely not. There are lots of people that benefit from, using what we have currently in terms of reps and sets and these type of things. And for some people, it works absolutely fantastically. For other people, it might not work so fantastically. And they're the people that we've got to think about. All right. So I think it's really important just to understand when I say exercise for fitness is not the same as exercise for pain. It doesn't mean that exercise for fitness can't help people, and it doesn't help people. It does. But it may not be for many of the reasons that we think, such as, the classic stretch and strengthen or motor control or any of these other reasons that the evidence has kind of failed to help us understand. So why is that? Why do people not just get fitter, get stronger, get longer, mobile, etc.? Why do they not do that and then all simply just get out of pain? Well, that's because not everyone is the same and they don't have the same baseline characteristics, and they don't have the same profile or biopsychosocial profile, or they don't have the same prognostic factors going on. So a prognosis just means the likely course of a problem, even with treatment. So natural history would be a problem without treatment. Prognosis is the problem with treatment. And some people may have negative prognostic factors, which leads to a poor prognosis. And here's a little model that I use for teaching. There's the very, very famous George Box quote, of course. All models are wrong, but some are useful, much like the BPS model. And we see that different people have these different baseline characteristics, such as we have two ends here of this kind of spectrum. At one end, we have this habituation where we give people a stimulus such as exercise, and that kind of desensitizes the system to that stimulus, and then hopefully to other stimulus as well. It becomes less irritable, it becomes less reactive, it becomes less sensitized. And that's a win. That's absolutely fantastic, right? Whereas on the other side, we have a whole bunch of other characteristics. And on the other side of that spectrum, we have this sensitization. So we keep giving people a stimulus. Maybe it doesn't make them worse, but for some people, it might make them worse. We give them this stimulus and they actually sensitize according to this stimulus and to other stimulus that's going on around them. And what we have here is some of the baseline characteristics that might be associated with that. That's why it's important to take a good history, to listen to your patient and to understand your patient beyond just what is their pathology or what is their problem. We need to understand their broader biopsychosocial profile, and then a little bit more about them as people as well. So on that sensitization stage side, we have high pain, high irritability, multi-site pain, lifestyle comorbidity, sedentary behaviors, poor psychological outlook or negative psychological outlook. And all of these things may lead to the stimulus that we give people, such as exercise, not having the desired result that we would like. And that's because their systems may be primed to more sensitization versus more habituation or a positive response to the stimulus that we're giving them. And ultimately, with treatment, what it is stimulus. And people's systems react to that stimulus, it responds to that stimulus and produces a response. And for some people, that might be analgesic. For some people, it might be very little. And then for other people, it might actually be hyperalgesic as well. And that's really important. So let's think about, how does this exercise thing work? And we're going to throw out some complex terminologies at you. And so I don't want to be too technical. My aim is always, rather than make things more technical, my idea is always to make the complex more simple. Sometimes you need to understand your shit to be able to do that. So let's see if I can do it, right? So the idea, first thing we have to think about is the idea of a mechanism. So not if something works, how something works. All right. When we do some evidence, when we do research, we're looking to know if something works. So looking at an outcome measure through a randomized controlled trial and then comparing that against another group. So how something works could be hypothesized, actually, of course. So we have lots of mechanistic hypotheses about how things work. In fact, a lot of the time, posture is a mechanistic hypothesis. We don't measure posture before or after. We just provide the treatment based on the mechanism. But a mechanism is how something works. And this is something from my friend Chad Cook. And he describes it as process through which an intervention unfolds and produces change in an outcome variable. So the outcome variable is if it works, right? That's the measurement variable. The mechanism is how that might work. And sometimes that's a little bit more complex to actually kind of measure, especially when we think about things like the internal physiology and biology of the human body. It's much easier to measure a measurement such as pain verbally rather than it is to measure some of the wonderful chemicals that are floating around our system and may produce hyper or hypoalgesia. We also have mediators and moderators. So a mediator is a causal variable. All right. So it's why something happens. And, it's not entirely always causal. It could explain a percentage of an outcome. And we also have a moderator, which explains the strength of a relationship between two variables. And I think lots of treatments have a moderating effect. So we give a treatment, it has an effect on pain, it moderates pain, but that change is maybe not actually affecting a causal variable. But we can't confuse a mediator with a mechanism. And actually, we might have a mediating variable and we don't actually know exactly what the mechanism is. And we might have a mechanism and not be able to see that as a mediator as well. All right. So, but don't worry about this stuff too much. If you're a nerd like me and you find it interesting, that's great. If you don't, it doesn't matter so much. It really, really doesn't. But I do think sometimes we can have a better understanding of some of the basic terminology and understanding. And when we talk about causal variables, I think there's three different areas that we should talk about. That would be predisposing, so a risk factor. And we could say that smoking is a risk factor for pain. We don't know exactly how it might cause musculoskeletal pain, but it certainly predisposes or increases our risk of developing it. The exact mechanism, we don't know. All right, it could be an initiating variable. So I might bend over and feel pain. It might be that it has caused pain in that moment, but what has sensitized that structure may not be what has caused the problem. And then we may have a maintaining factor as well. And this often happens, I think, with psychological variables. Is that we may develop a pain or an injury, and that may be nociceptive in origin, but maybe some of the things that maintain it could be plasticity of the nervous system, and then maybe how our psychological status affects our behaviors as well. All right. So again, causation is not just as simple as X equals Y. Causal variables could be predisposing, initiating, or maintaining. So when people are talking about what has caused this, Sometimes we don't know because the initial cause may have been and gone, such as a tissue damage. But some of the plastic changes that occur after that might maintain that problem. So again, just understanding the philosophy of causation a little better. So let's think about exercise and pain, and think about maybe what are some of these mediators and mechanisms. And I've kind of lumped it all in together because I don't want to make it too technical and everyone falls asleep and they get upset with me and these type of things. So one of the things that I think we don't consider enough is the inflammatory system and the immune system. That's something that I think we may have for some people a pro-inflammatory environment within the body. And when we exercise over maybe a longer period of time, that can maybe have an epigenetic shift to a more anti-inflammatory part of the body. Again, we probably don't have the sets and the reps for that quite yet, but we'll talk about that. Self-efficacy has been quite a well-described mediator. Again, our belief in our ability to do some things with pain, whether that's activity or exercise or movement. Again, that would be a mediator, and we may be unsure of the mechanism currently. So biomechanics, it might be that changing someone's biomechanics changes the nociception from the tissue, symptom modification, etc. That's a very plausible potential mechanism. Habituation. So again, habituation is an interesting mechanistic concept, but it's a mechanistic concept we don't actually know the mechanism for. So it's quite a loose mechanistic thing. And habituation is just a decreased response to a repeated stimulus, right? So it could be that we have tissue related factors such as mechanotransduction, that as we move and we exercise and we have autocrine and paracrine processes occurring within the tissue itself. We have fibroblasts that lay down more collagen, and maybe that makes the tissue more robust and stronger and more able to cope with things. One of my favorite plausible mechanisms here would just simply be the idea of blood flow and oxygen. That when we look at research, we see that so many different exercise types can help people. There was the Jill Hayden paper from 2021 that looked at exercise for back pain, and we see Pilates, range of movement, strength, motor control, McKenzie, everything in there. And all of them seem to exert some kind of effect. Some were high dose, some were low dose. They had various different characteristics of the program, but they all shared some element of moving. And the effect of exercise on pain could simply be we are taking good metabolic stuff, pushing it into the tissue through moving, through kind of, just basic pump, just as we see with things like osteoarthritis and how we get shit into discs through diffusion. The body works mechanically. It actually gets a transfer of stuff into tissues and out of tissues through things like just mechanical factors. Could it be plausible that we bathe irritable acid sensing ion channels in beautiful blood, and it has a high level of oxygen within it, and that brings this kind of calming effect? We don't know, but for me that's an exceptionally plausible mechanism, that it's simply basic metabolic activity or basic physiology occurring within an ischemic tissue. It could be descending inhibition. And, this is where we get into the idea of non-specific effects, is that, how many different treatments could activate the descending inhibitory systems. So we get opioids, cannabinoids, serotonin, all these wonderful things. Manual therapy, exercise, dry needling, whatever you want to pull out of the bag, if we are getting acute changes within pain, might activate what happens within the descending inhibitory systems. And then finally, could it also be psychological? Could it be that we are perceiving things differently, and the perceptual element of pain kicks in and these type of things. So just thinking also about um, stuff that happens at a perceptual level, our beliefs, our expectations, and then how we may actually violate some of these things as well, which I think is really, really cool. So there are a whole bunch of different reasons that I could plausibly say these could have an effect on someone's pain when I am using exercise or movement as an intervention. Now, it's important that we separate them in some way. So we should separate them into acute changes and more chronic behavioral changes. I think that's really important. So if we're talking about symptom modification, that will often be an acute change, short-term change, where we've changed movement, maybe changed nociception from the tissue. And if we do that enough, does that tissue calm down? So it might be there's an acute element and a chronic element, but initially we would be reducing the amount of nociception coming from the tissue. We just talked about blood flow and oxygen. Again, that transfer of blood is going to be an acute thing. Although if we do it enough times, does that provide, a desensitization, a habituation? Descending inhibition, getting those chemicals going and descending down the spinal cord and out into where they need to go to. Again, they are going to be acute changes. Maybe over the longer term, we see chronic changes in the rostroventromedial medulla. We have what are called on and off cells that either facilitate nociception or inhibit nociception. And again, that might be kind of a switch that gets flicked at some point towards a more pro or anti-nociceptive system, if you like. And then again, these perceptual elements are probably to some degree happening at an acute level as well, or a short-term level. Let me grab some water. It's hard to talk this much without getting a bit of a dry throat. So again, just kind of highlighting basically what I'm talking about. So changes in the chemical state of the tissue. So decreasing ischemia and decreasing acidosis, which likely sensitize those peripheral nociceptors. Or, well, nociceptors can only be peripheral. So biomechanic symptom modification, decreasing nociception from the tissue. And then our beliefs and expectations are perceptual changes. And again, they may relate to treatment expectations, which will affect all treatments. So that could be manipulations, mobilizations, ultrasound, exercise, whatever you want. They are all going to actually, if you think about the things here, actually they could all be affected by those. So when we talk about mechanisms of analgesia, they're not just tied into exercise. They are non-specific, meaning they may be specific to a context and a person, but they are not specific to a treatment. Manual therapy and exercise could be very, very similar mechanistically. We just activate those mechanisms in different ways and maybe mechanically different. So descending modulation, again, this is something very technical shit, isn't it? I do apologize for being all technical and shit. This is our internal opioid mechanisms. The word we would use would be endogenous. So exogenous means external, endogenous means internal. So if I want some exogenous opioids, I have to find a man to sell me that shit. But I would love to activate my internal opioid mechanisms because they're going to kind of dampen down some of that nociceptive stuff. As I said before, they're probably a really important reason for the effects of all interventions. It could be stimulated mechanically, and it could be stimulated perceptually as well. It involves, lots of different kind of activation mechanisms. And actually descending I talk a bit about descending inhibition and the positive chemicals. Could there also be chemicals that are turning things up? So we could have things like GABA, which turn things down. So that's an agonist for NMDA, which would be something that turns things up. And that is the modulation. So it's not just inhibitory, it's modulatory, which means that actually these mechanisms could be placebo or nocebo. All right. When we look at the chronic changes, these are probably a little bit more longer term based. Why does Ben even bring this up? Well, it's not doing a couple of exercises probably is not going to create a chronic change. So this is where we talk about behavior change. So the sets and the reps of a deadlift probably don't matter very much, but how much you go to the gym and actually do stuff, or how much you play sport with your friends, or how much you just go out in the garden and dig up the weeds does matter. All right. So this is more about chronic, longer term behavioral change mechanisms. So we can have shorter term or longer term, and sometimes shorter term leads to longer term. But again, this is so important that we understand that a big part of the power in exercise might be in the behavior change, not how you teach a deadlift. So the inflammatory system, again, we know that takes time to change its function. When we look at activity, self-efficacy, again, you're going to need to do things enough to create changes in someone's belief and violating their expectancy. Habituation literally requires a repeat stimulus, so you have to repeat it. And then again, something like mechanotransduction, laying down new collagen, that again is going to take a repeated action. So we have the kind of shorter term acute changes that we might see modulated by all of those funky chemicals. And then we see these more chronic behavioral change mechanisms that probably require quite a lot of more engagement. And actually, we focus too much sometimes on the thing itself and not enough on the behavior change aspect. All right. So the power of chronic exercise changes isn't in finding the best exercise program for everybody. It's about intrinsic motivation. It's about helping people find their values and their goals. But there are mechanisms here, such as the immune system, that underpin why that may help. All right, mechanotransduction being tissue adaptations to load. That doesn't require the brain. This is, stuff that's localized. This is actual cellular responses to load. Self-efficacy, again, another way to describe it would be reducing pain interference. And then habituation is being a decreased response to a stimulus, whether that's a stimulus we give people or that is an aggravating stimulus that's occurring within their world or their context themselves. And this is fascinating. This is work by Catherine Sluka, just looking at sedentary versus active people and looking at some of the mechanisms that there were. And they created changes. And I think you could probably describe them as epigenetic changes. So changes to our gene function according to exposure to a stimulus. And here the stimulus would be exercise. So over, I think it was a 6 weeks period, they found that there were changes within the opioid system and switching to more of an inhibitory kind of default rather than a facilitatory default mechanism. And that might involve, as we see there, NMDA receptors and various other things, and how certain mechanisms kind of block the uptake of some of those chemicals. And that's the idea of the agonist and the antagonist, is that they kind of block each other. But we do have really good information here, but we don't know, what type of training does that. But we do know it's much more behavioral than it is finding the perfect exercise. It's about finding that thing for the person, not just, what did your favorite internet guru say was the best exercise. Really interesting here as well, again from Chad Cook. What they were looking at here was the immune system and some of the cytokines that are floating around. And we have things like interleukins. Interleukins are, our immune system function. And what they found here was that manual therapy really didn't influence in the same way as exercise, this chronic anti-inflammatory cytokine profile. So chronic exercise, long-term shifts in our behavior, it changes our immune system function towards one that is anti-inflammatory. So how powerful is that? That it's not, about, is Pilates better than strength training for lower back pain? Engagement in both of them over the longer term, a level that is enough to stimulate whatever, actually creates these shifts in our immune system function. How cool is that? I think that's ultra cool. But again, it takes us away from the idea of sets and reps back to the idea of changing behavior towards a more active lifestyle. And again, that would fit with a biopsychosocial approach rather than, say, a corrective exercise approach. All right. So, as I have you here, if you are interested in these kind of discussions and talks and stuff like that, we have the mentorship, core kinetic mentorship coming up in a few weeks' time, 8 weeks of really kind of in depth learning. We're going to talk about things like research interpretation. We're going to talk about communication, the biopsychosocial model, pain science, exercise prescription, clinical reasoning, common conditions, really get into the weeds from someone who knows how to talk about it. We're going to have live sessions. We're going to have research papers, special guests, case studies, practical exercise stuff. Already got a whole bunch of people signed up from all over the world. So if that's something that might tickle your fancy, you want to get deeper learning, not just Instagram slides, and want to get really into this type of stuff and, you know, improve yourself in that way, please think about joining me. As you've come to this lecture, I might even include a special gift for those who sign up. Anyway, advert over, do apologize, but you are a captive audience. So when we look at the immune system, we are having to understand this is longer term, right? This is about epigenetic changes, and we said that the change comes from the exposure. The change comes from the exposure to exercise, and what we want is an anti-nociceptive environment. We want an anti-inflammatory environment that comes from better lifestyle, more engagement in physical activity, these type of things, and is a little bit about the behavior more than the sets and the reps. This is one of the little tools that I use, one of the little models that I use for teaching, and it is about how do we get to where we want to get to with our patient. And what we see here is let's pick the most likely area that this exercise is going to help this patient, and then we can program it accordingly. So again, all models are rubbish, some are useful. I describe this as imprecise precision, where we are trying to be a little bit more precise, still understanding the individuality of the patient. So when we are trying to get more engagement for some of these chronic elements, we are thinking about what are the barriers and facilitators for their engagement. We are thinking about what is intrinsically motivating them. We are thinking about what are their values and what do they, what do they want and what do they need from doing this, and how do we tap into that? And then also secondary to gaining a value, we're also thinking about how can we get people to do things that they enjoy. All right. And sometimes, again, it does boil back down to that behavioral change element that I think is super important. Now, let's actually look at a little bit of research. So this was looking at a recent trial into Pilates exercise with my great friend Leanne Wood. I met Leanne many, many years ago at an Explain Pain course, actually, way up in York, up there, up in the north of England. And I can't remember when that was, 2014, 2015, but she's gone on to do some really fantastic stuff. And I always remember the great chats that we had there. Here they did a mediation analysis of a Pilates intervention for chronic lower back pain. And what they wanted to find out was what were some of the things that mediated this. And so this isn't the mechanism, this would be a mediator. And what they actually found here, that one of the things that mediated, or two of the things that mediated pain intensity, the variable we're all interested in, one was pain catastrophizing. So having less extreme reactions or worry about experiencing pain or the future. And then also kinesiophobia, so fear of movement. So a lot of the time, I think we think that Pilates is about activating the core and stabilizing shit so there's not these damaging micro movements, etc. But actually, one of the mechanisms was pain catastrophizing, so decreased worry about pain. And then the other was decreased worry about movement. And certainly we would describe these as psychological variables. They are psychological mediators. And if something is mediated, even in part psychologically, does that mean we should maybe focus on some of those elements, or, create some techniques or ways of interacting that may actually take advantage of that mediation? So rather than thinking Pilates is all about activating that core, getting those toned abs, stabilizing the spine, maybe actually it's about making people feel safer to move and actually worrying less about pain. And they did a nice little diagram that kind of explains some of the pathways and the effects that they looked at. So there we see the intervention mediator effect. Pain catastrophizing at 6 weeks had an effect on pain intensity at 6 months. And I like the way they describe Pilates exercise: once, twice, or thrice. Sounds like a Shakespearean novel. This was another paper from Australian group there, led by James McCauley and Aidan Cashin. And they had an education and graded sensory motor retraining program in people with chronic lower back pain. All right, so they started off with simple spinal movements, and they had, a psychological kind of approach that said finding it was safe to move, understand that it was safe to move through education, feeling it was safe to move, and then experiencing it was safe to move. So, we could describe that a little bit like as an exposure kind of embodied approach, which sounds really good. CFT may use that type of approach as well. And just general exposure therapy may use these type of approaches as well. But what mediated um, their outcomes? So these two at the top would be relating to, these kind of motor control variables, motor coordination, tactile acuity. And actually, we see that the effect on the outcome was very low. Back perceptions was an effect, kinesiophobia, pain self-efficacy in there, which I think is a really important one, pain catastrophizing, beliefs about back pain, and then all of these things stuck together. And we see some quite wide confidence intervals, and that's completely to be understood. Although back beliefs didn't have wide confidence intervals, and certainly confidence intervals that didn't cross zero. In fact, the two top variables had confidence intervals that crossed zero. So we could say, maybe they are not, don't have much of a mediating effect. And then, so, I think that's pretty cool to look at. So we would probably see those more as psychological variables as the major driving force in that intervention versus the acuity and the motor coordination. If we look at research, interestingly, from the CFT guys, and this was from Kevin Wernley, and they did a mediation analysis, or a movement analysis of one of their trials. And what they wanted to know was movement associated, and I use the word association, not causation here. But association is the first step to causation in some ways. And so if we look at here, for some of the patients, their biomechanics, the way that they bent their spine in terms of the amplitude and the range and these type of things, they were associated for the two on the left. If we look on the right side, they weren't associated so much. Again, what this slide really highlights is that what may be associated with change, or a mediator or a mechanism of change for one person, may not be the same reason something changes for another person. But it is good to know, on average, is it likely to be more mediated by the mechanics? Is it likely to be more mediated by various other variables as well? And they did another mediation analysis here. And they actually found one of the big mediators changed about 48% of the total effect on disability was increased pain self-efficacy. So this idea of kind of being a little bit more okay with having and actually doing some things with pain. So one of the other little sayings I have on my course is zero pain is not the goal. And what that means is sometimes we have this idea we always have to take pain away. Sometimes a role of exercise might be not to have pain or not to give pain per se, but sometimes we have pain, we move, we still have pain, and maybe that's an opportunity to change our relationship with pain and maybe de-threaten it, change its interference on what we do and how we do it. But pain self-efficacy, I think, actually has some really strong kind of research around it. And I think one of the basic things we need to do sometimes with some people is change their relationship with pain. Sometimes taking pain away or never doing anything with it that not causes pain, but that has any pain attached to it. I think that might be doing some people a disservice, even though everyone feels like it's actually doing a service, because we may be perpetuating pain-related behaviors and pain-related interference and disability. In fact, here in this paper, back in 2003, so 21 years ago, just as old as I am, they found that self-efficacy actually was the most important predictor of disability, then fear avoidance, then pain intensity. All right. So I think that's really important. We often say, well, pain intensity is the reason people aren't doing things. And if you took their pain away, then that would be fine. But actually, it doesn't just seem to be the pain. It actually seems to be the self-efficacy associated with that pain as well, which I think is really interesting. Here's a little tweet from myself, a little bit of self-promotion. Well, not really self-promotion per se, but just getting my point across that if we want to improve pain self-efficacy through exercise, then we have to have an element of discomfort involved. I'm not saying cause pain, but often there is discomfort, and just not stopping when there is discomfort. And then also kind of being able to talk about that and reframe that and maybe recontextualize that and that kind of thing. So if we want to change pain self-efficacy, we need variables associated with pain self-efficacy. And one of the big complaints is, we don't know if strength mediates pain, if strength doesn't change. We can't say that those two things are not associated, even though we have evidence they're not that well associated. But we would never expect strength to change without actually emphasizing load or effort. We cannot expect pain self-efficacy to change without an emphasis on pain and self-efficacy of pain. That would just be nonsensical and is nonsensical. Right, so we are going to do a little thought experiment to finish tonight. We are going to think about taking one exercise and adjusting it and adapting it according to different mediators or mechanisms. So we often like to change the exercise to change the effect or the outcome. I actually believe we could keep an exercise the same, but change the variables and emphasis around that exercise to take advantage of potential mediators and mechanisms that we identify. So let's take pain self-efficacy. So if we wanted to do a deadlift, and we thought pain self-efficacy was low, maybe you measured it using the pain self-efficacy questionnaire, the PSEQ. First thing is that we might, not stop if there was some discomfort or some pain. We might want to discuss pain pre-deadlift. We might want to think about pain post-deadlift. So, was it as bad as they thought it was going to be? What does that pain actually lead to? Does it a bit sorer? But is it still safe? And I love that terminology, sore but safe, because that allows us to do a few more things and stops pain from interfering so much as long as it doesn't increase sensitization. And that's the balance, isn't it? Is that we want, to be a bit better off with pain. We still want to be able to do the things that we want to do or need to do or value, but without without more sensitization of that painful problem. All right. But if I want to do a deadlift that has an effect on pain self-efficacy, there may be specific variables that I need to engage with. So strength with a deadlift. Well, of course, we're going to have to focus on low reps and higher load, aren't we? Basically, if you want to get stronger, you probably need to pick up heavier shit. And the deadlift is a great exercise to do that. I would like to pick the equipment that allows me to pick up the heaviest load. I would measure changes within that strength. And as that load becomes greater, I'm probably going to be a little bit stricter on the performance of that exercise, simply because I want it to be the most effective and efficient to increase someone's strength. So one might focus on pain, one might focus on strength. I actually believe the most common variable that we have an effect on for patients is simply their confidence to move. And that rehabilitation creates a positive environment for people to use their bodies. And what they're going to do is they're going to build their confidence. Maybe that leads to a little bit of lifestyle change where they're going to use their bodies a bit more. They're going to go back to the gym or go back to doing activities that they enjoy. And that's going to have a positive effect. So confidence is much more generalized than self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is a very, quite a rigid concept in that it relates only to a specific domain. Whereas confidence is probably much more broad and wider. All right. So if I want to improve my patient's confidence to use their body through a deadlift, I'm thinking about not overcoaching. I'm thinking about giving positive feedback. I'm making sure that they're successful. So not making it so hard that I have to overcoach. And I'm going to think about their concerns and their worries and, answer their questions and make a very open environment for that person to kind of ask their questions and make sure they feel heard and these type of things. All right. Still the same exercise. Let's think about movement variability. So a deadlift, again, doesn't have to be done with a barbell. That seems to be the most common thing. Could you do it with a kettlebell? You could do a kettlebell deadlift, no problems. A dumbbell, a bag, or whatever. Movement variability with a deadlift might be using different objects. It might be taking a non-linear approach. And if you're interested in movement variability, something people don't talk a lot about is what's called non-linear pedagogy. Looking at ways that we change environment and ecological dynamics to create an environment that requires change and adaptation. Maybe and again, that would be why we create a movement problem versus a movement solution. And actually, rather than looking to reduce rep to rep differences, as we often do, and might be good for something like hypertrophy for a repeat stimulus, we might actually promote rep to rep differences to create that variability. There seems to be this idea that the variability is like adding in something people don't have. I think a lot of the movement variability concepts now sound a lot to me like corrective exercise. So if you can't, pronate, I'm going to get you to pronate. That's corrective. That's not variability. But anyway, move on. Maybe I want to create some kind of expectancy violation. Making that person feel de-threatened around that problem. Yeah, and we don't always reduce fear when it comes to violation processes. Sometimes actually we build courage and build confidence. We may aim at fear, but build courage. Just as a little kind of, if you understand anything about expectancy violation, blah de blah. So thinking about identifying fears and beliefs. So remember that graded exposure is a psychological concept. Graded exercise or graded activity is the process of the actual physical action. So graded exposure is actually psychological change, and that often involves a physical action. But what we're measuring is not the amount of exposure to the physical activity. We are measuring the amount of change in that person's belief structure. And sometimes we could call that kind of cognitive restructuring, which is changing our beliefs around something. So to do that, to create change in belief, you might need to identify those fears and beliefs. We might need to create a reasonably safe environment around that deadlift. Maybe they have a fear of picking things up, for example. And one of the things that we'd like to find out is the discrepancy between the expectation and the outcome. Was it as bad as you thought it was going to be? If you thought it was going to be 10 out of 10 pain and it was only 7 out of 10 pain, well, that's an expectancy violation, an uncomfortable one, but certainly something that we can do. And then think about, how do we use that information moving forward? All right. Remember, what we've done here is we've adapted the same exercise, the deadlift, to kind of take advantage of lots of these different mechanisms or mediators that we've identified. And actually, that might be more powerful than just banging out those 3 sets of 10 reps. Or it might be that you could include little bits and pieces of different things here. So if we want to change engagement or adherence, maybe the deadlift, we emphasize the relevance of that to the problem. We help people enjoy it. If we really think about enjoyment, maybe it's not even about enjoyment. Maybe it's making it meaningful. How do you relate the exercise to the problem and to solving the problem, and upping that kind of engagement, adherence, whatever you want to call it? And then also, how do I get the easiest possible deadlift going so that I can repeat it at home? I can do it in lots of different ways. All right. So the emphasis on the exercise might change according to the mechanism that we think is going to be most beneficial for the person that we are working with. So one of the problems is people say to me, Ben, what is the best exercise for back pain? Which is a pretty dumb question given the evidence that we have. But at the same point, we could take the same exercise, and it's not the exercise that matters. It's the way that you actually use the exercise that might be really, really powerful and might create that change for your patient. I think we're at the end there. Yeah. So look, oh, Jesus, we've gone dark. There we go. So it went dark in my in my study while I was talking. So it's the nights are drawing in here. Look, so I hope you enjoyed that little dive into kind of pain and exercise and mechanisms and mediators and all this nerdy shit that some people may not be interested in, but we know that what we're currently doing isn't having the effect that we want it to. All right, let's all be honest with ourselves. You know, the effects that we're able to have on pain using exercise and movement aren't as good as we could make them. And I think exploring the why, not just exploring the how and the why, not just if it has an effect, can lead to having a bigger effect. And also just nerding out, understanding a bit more about the human body, physiology, etc. We get really nerdy about biomechanics, but actually the body, you know, the biomechanics of the body aren't half as important as the physiology, and the neurology and the perceptual elements. And I think we need to move towards some of that stuff, even though it's a little bit more complex. So we have a few minutes. I don't know if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask. Ahmed says here, there was a recent paper out of Australia by Matt Jones. I actually think it was Matt Jones was one of the authors, but we actually had the guy who was the lead author on the BCP to talk about that. I can't remember his name. It was a Middle Eastern name, I think, Giuliani or Juliana or something like that. And that was his paper. And what was really interesting about the paper was that barriers and facilitators, for some people, the facilitators were the barriers, and some people, the barriers were the facilitators. So again, what gets people to adhere to stuff isn't always the same. So look, if anyone's got a quick question they want to ask, then I'd be more than happy to answer it if everyone has had all of their questions answered. And do you know what? I'm going to send out a recording for those people. I'm going to send out something to you guys in the next couple of days, and probably a little advertisement for my mentorship as well. That is the game we're going to play. Britta, great question. How far do you think a client's mood can affect pain? Well, actually, if we look at the research here, I don't think there's a direct link between mood and nociception. So I don't think we see a really, really strong change in measures of sensitivity, such as quantitative sensory testing. But I think sometimes when we are down, we are low, pain feels worse in the sense that we don't cope as well with it. It might still be 5 out of 10, but I don't cope as well with that 5 out of 10. And there's some work by Natalia Costa that's looked at pain flares, and they find pain flares aren't always greater pain, but they're worse psychosocial features. So the relationship between pain and psychosocial features might be coping, not increasing pain directly. So Kong Lu, can you talk a bit more about self-efficacy, pain self-efficacy? So self-efficacy is my belief in my ability to do something. Pain self-efficacy is my belief in my ability to do things despite pain. So go dancing, play football, bend over, fill the dishwasher. If I have very, very low beliefs in my ability to function with any pain, that tends to lead to worse outcomes. So, anonymous attendee, that's an interesting name. What about exercise in patients with high pain scores? This is where dosage adaptation is really important. They're much more likely to sensitize than habituate. So I think the stimulus should decrease. And again, I use the rule of 10, and I talk a lot about pain irritability and pain intensity in the relationship, and how changing dosage is probably one of the keys. So changing the stimulus versus the response. Amir says here, does pathology like disc herniation or stuff like that affect exercise prescription? There are no exercises for disc herniations that are better than any else. There was a recent paper that looked at physio intervention for things like sciatica, and they found there isn't a method. But I would say, making sure that whatever you're doing is not aggravating the problem and, creating a worse inflammatory environment. Would you say your explained concepts apply to athletic lower back pain from Alexa? Well, they can only explain that, I think. We only have set physiology. I think if we look into athletic, athletes have the same physiology as non-athletes, in the sense that we have the same systems. They may have genetically better systems, but athletes may actually have greater anti-nociceptive ability. So absolutely, that would affect athletic low back pain. Yeah, absolutely. Is it okay if I watch the whole webinar with their spine in not a neutral position? I hope you watch the webinar with your spine in not a neutral position. Whether you're here tomorrow morning, we don't know. You may be dead, but I hope not. I pray for you, my brother. What is your opinion on the biggest way in which we influence the patient negatively? Shit we tell them, no CBIC. Remember, we talked about pain modulation, behavior modulation. So if you tell people their back is all fucked up, they are less likely to use it, and therefore they are less likely to have a positive physiological environment. What do you think about the self-confidence of the practitioner? Onur, I think that probably definitely has an effect. Probably definitely. Undoubtedly has an effect. How much effect? We think of context has around a 20% of the overall effect that we see throughout the course of change. So about 50% tends to be natural history, or just the course of the problem. About 30% is specific to the treatment, and then about 20% would be contextual, or what you just described. Have an MSK B6 interview in 2 weeks. Will we receive a certificate for this? Absolutely not. There's no way I can write out hundreds of certificates. Soz. If a patient has 10 to 10 pain scale, how to reduce it by exercise through a deadlift? I probably wouldn't use a deadlift. I would use something much, much more gentle. 10 out of 10, reactive, irritable problem. I'd probably start off with a very, very low stimulus, something like a basic pelvic tilt. Uh, Ahmed's asked another question. What about the use of dry needling? If you feel justified to use it, use it. I would call it a moderator of pain, whether that's mechanistic or perceptual, whether it's kind of anti-nociceptive perceptual, I don't know. But I would definitely say it was more of a moderator rather than a mediator of the problem. Would you recommend a book to learn more about pain physiology? Not so much a book. I think there's so many articles out there. Although I think some of the NOI guys have some interesting pain physiology in some of their books. Sensitive nervous system. The Gifford books have great pain physiology in them. All right, I'm going to do two more. So, is education or exercise more important when dealing with chronic non-specific lower back pain? I would say education, although education should hopefully lead to behavior change, such as activity and exercise. Not a lot of stuff outperforms education for MSK issues across the body. How important is muscular endurance? No idea. Probably about as important as strength, which doesn't seem to be that important. So Max said, can you repeat it? So the overall change that we see from an intervention, from in a trial, would be 50% natural history, 30% the specific effect of treatment, and then 20% relates to the context of what happens around us. And you've asked loads of questions. Thank you so much, Ben. Well, thank you for saying thank you. As I said, the best way to thank me would be to do a little Insta story, say how much you enjoyed this pain lecture and how smart and funny, tall and handsome Ben is. That would be absolutely fantastic. So, guys, really, I appreciate you coming on and listening to me. We had a few hundred people from all over the world. My pleasure to be able to reach people and talk about stuff. I will send you a recording, maybe a little special gift if you sign up for the mentorship program. And love you. See you later.